So my little parish, if you look us up on the interwebs, on Google, you'll see that we have some reviews, just a couple. Most of the reviews are like, lovely little parish, wonderful place, right? Beautiful building, beautiful people. We have one review, I'm going to paraphrase it here. It's been there, I think it predates my time here, but it's close to I remember it being posted around the time that I showed up. So either right before or maybe right after, I don't know. And I hate to say it's hard not to laugh at it, but I'm going to paraphrase the review. The review basically says that I've been to funeral services more lively than the services at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. For one, as a priest, it would have been nice if this individual would have come to somebody in the church and vocalized that in person, so we could actually do something with it, right? As opposed to just kind of bashing us on Google. But it is what it is. But it's very clear to me in this person's way of thinking. So, been to funeral services that are more lively, more rockin' and jivin', or whatever you want to say, right? More upbeat than services at St. Paul's Episcopal. Implicit in that way of looking at our parish is this idea that, like, the church is meant to entertain you. It exists for your consumption, right? And if it's not entertaining enough, it's not spiritual enough, it's not worth your time, right? I push back against that tremendously as a priest. I take some pride when people get a bit bored. Not overly bored, not bored the entire time, but when people find our services a bit boring, I take some pride in that as a priest. You know why? Because if you're bored in church, you know for sure that I'm not trying to brainwash you. I am not trying to manipulate you emotionally to evoke a certain type of response out of you, right? I'm just letting the service be what it is, right? With the hopes that people who participate in the service can let themselves be what they are as well, right? And there's something to be said for beautifying services and having some energy and some zeal, right? Some passion, but like a response to a church like this one, it would be like somebody walking into like a monastery and seeing monks in meditation and saying, well, those people have no heart. They have no passion for what they're doing, right? They interpret the silence as deadness, right? As lack of zeal. When, if you've met any number of monks, right, you know that the opposite of that is the case. It's like basically saying like Thomas Merton was just passionless, right? Thich Nhat Hanh was just passionless because he spent all this time in silence and meditation, right? Yeah, it's just a really sad way of looking at religion and worship and what the church is meant to be about, in my opinion. But it's a view that so many people share, right? People come to church and they're like, well, I'm bored. They believe that's the church's problem. I'm sorry. I'm just going to say it bluntly, whether you like it or not. Like, if you cannot sit for about an hour in relative silence with other people one morning a week, right? I'm sorry, that says way more about you than it does about the church, about us, right? And a wider perspective, it says way more about the culture than it does about Christianity. We've lost the ability to just sit in silence, to sit in stillness, And as one philosopher said, was it Blaise Pascal, said that the greatest problem in the world today is that people cannot sit in a room alone by themselves, right? Now, granted, at church, you're not sitting in a room alone by yourself, but the same idea is there. Like the biggest problem in the world today is that we no longer have opportunities for silence. We're consumers. To be human is to be consumeristic. And so if something doesn't satiate your appetite immediately, doesn't entertain the shit out of you immediately, well, it's just discarded, right? Yeah, you could go that route. And then there are many churches who they're really focused on just copycatting whatever fad is going on for the sake of reeling people in, entertaining people into the faith, entertaining people into heaven, right? Let's just get some smoke machines and let's hire like a knockoff version of like Nickelback to be our praise band, and that's what's going to do it, right? But psychologists have been saying for such a long time that those Carl Jung did a big study on this. Those communal atmospheres where the main goal is just to trigger an emotional response from you, to get you on an emotional high. Those are the communal contexts where people are actually transformed the least. And Carl Jung actually celebrated the traditional Eucharist as being one of the most potent transformative mechanisms out there for awakening to the true self and overcoming the false self, right? And it's because it's not trying to manipulate you emotionally, right? It's actually being countercultural. It's not trying to do the consumeristic thing and reel you in and entertain you and treat you as if the customer is always right. Uh, when it comes to church, you're not always right. And it's not about you, and it's not about your feelings, right? It's actually about God. The church is not a product to be consumed, it's a relationship to be had, a community to be a part of. It's a being, your personhood to be discovered in the context of community, to echo what we talked about last week. And so, why go to church? I think many people leave the church because it's not entertaining for them enough, right? And there's many people who will interact with like a context like mine where we have more traditional worship. On Sunday mornings, you'll see me in all of the robes. We have all the colors. We've got all the rituals, right? We got all that stuff. And rather than taking the time to ask the questions about, well, like, what do these things mean? People just say, well, these are archaic and old and they have no meaning, right? And so then they just abandon it rather than understanding the language of the liturgical poetry itself, all of its poetry, right? All of its a form of artwork, in a way. Yeah, and then the ironic thing in that too is like, so as people abandon traditional forms of worship because they're not entertained enough, people are also they're like turning to like spiritual practices that lead to non-duality, that lead to greater mindfulness, that lead to deeper meditation. The infuriating thing as a priest is like the Eucharist itself is the epitome of non-dual spirituality. The Eucharist itself is meant to be a meditative experience. Now, granted, and to be fair, not every church has this self-awareness of itself, and not every church creates space for silence where meditation can actually occur. Not every church focuses on these things, but like the meditative person who's into non-dual spirituality and into like mindfulness practices should pick up right away, right? If you're really into it, you'll pick up right away that this is the type of thing that the Eucharist is trying to invoke in you, to invite you into, right? I mean, just there's every movement, every single part of the liturgy, the Eucharist, right? It's about practicing non-duality, waking up to non-duality, the oneness that we have with one another. We are one body in Christ, right? It's about waking up to this oneness that we share. Just one example, right? Like uh, in the Eucharist, you see the bread in the priest's hands, right? And then moments later, the bread goes from being there to like within you and a part of you, right? The duality between you and the bread, you and the real presence of Jesus has been overcome in the liturgy, right? But it's so ironic to me that we forsake these traditional things and simultaneously turn to things that the tradition has, right? That are a part of the tradition. So we forsake Eucharist, but we seek non-dual spirituality. Well, the Eucharist is non-dual spirituality. We forsake praying in church and we try to practice mindfulness. Like, it's all about mindfulness, right? It's just, yeah, yeah. We go to church to deepen our spirituality, to bring our spirituality, right? Not just to be entertained. And if you're coming and you find yourself, right, oh, this church is boring. It's not entertaining enough for me. The preaching isn't entertaining enough. The liturgy, the singing, whatever. It's just not, it's just off for me. Like, maybe ask yourself the question, maybe are you off for it? Instead of just assuming that this product doesn't work for you because yeah, right? You know, I'll say this again at some other point, and I'm fading the COVID. I'm still recovering from COVID. I'm getting tired, as you can tell. But oftentimes we in our culture want to say, well, the church is no longer like relevant to modern culture. I actually disagree. I actually think it's modern culture that is no longer relevant to the church. I'll let you chew on that one. So, thank you for listening. We'll see you next Saturday.